Good morning, everyone. Happy Monday. So, today is going to be the last reading that I'm doing with you guys for this series because I'm having my baby today, and I did pre-record this. So don't worry, I'm not getting up at like 4 a.m. to sit here and read it before I go to the hospital, but I will be sure to show the baby off to everybody once we get them settled at home and all that stuff. So anyway, but I just want to say it's been really fun reading to you all, and I'm glad to be able to do this one last one before I'm out on my maternity leave. So today I'm going to read chapter 2 of James Herriot's book, All Creatures Great and Small. We read chapter 1 a couple weeks ago, and to recap, this is the story of a vet in the English countryside in the 1930s, and even though it's kind of one chapter after another, they can also sort of stand alone. So the first one was about his encounter with one of his veterinary patients late at night, and a funny story about that. And then this one will be about something different. So it's fine to kind of read the chapters standalone. So if you didn't hear chapter 1, it's not a big deal. But he talks about his family and his wife, and then his adventures as a country vet. I had only to sit up in bed to look right across Derby to the hills beyond. I got up and walked to the window. It was going to be a fine morning, and the early sun glanced over the weathered reds and grays of the jumbled roofs, some of them sagging under their burden of ancient tiles, and brightened the tufts of green where trees pushed upward from the gardens among the bristle of chimney pots, and behind everything the calm bulk of the fells. It was my good fortune that this was the first thing I saw every morning, after Helen, of course, which was better still. Following our unorthodox tuberculin testing honeymoon, we had set up our first home on the top of Skeldale House. Siegfried, my boss up to my wedding, and now my partner, had offered us free use of these empty rooms on the 3rd story, and we had gratefully accepted. And though it was a makeshift arrangement, there was an airy charm, an exhilaration in our high perch that many would have envied. It was makeshift because everything at that time had a temporary complexion, and we had no idea how long we would be there. Siegfried and I had both volunteered for the RAF and were on deferred service, but that is all I'm going to say about the war. This book is not about such things which in any case were so very far from Derby. It is the story of the months I had with Helen between our marriage and my call-up, and is about the ordinary things which have always made up our lives, my work, the animals, and the Dales. This front room was our bed-sitter, and though it was not luxuriously furnished, it did have an excellent bed, a carpet, a handsome side table, which had belonged to Helen's mother, and 2 armchairs. It had an ancient wardrobe, too, but the lock didn't work, and the only way we kept the door closed was by jamming one of my socks in it. The toe always dangled outside, but it never seemed of any importance. I went out and across a few feet of landing to our kitchen dining room at the back. This apartment was definitely Spartan. I clumped over bare boards to a bench we had rigged against the wall by the window. This held a gas ring and our crockery and cutlery. I seized a tall jug and began my long descent to the main kitchen downstairs, because one minor snag was that there was no water at the top of the house. Down 2 flights to the 3 rooms on the 1st story, then down 2 more, and a final gallop across the passage to the big stone-flagged kitchen at the end. Excuse me. I filled the jug and returned to our eyrie 2 steps at a time. I wouldn't like to do this now whenever I needed water, but at the time I didn't find it the least inconvenient. Helen soon had the kettle boiling, and we drank our first cup of tea by the window, looking down on the long garden. From up here we had an aerial view of the unkempt lawns, the fruit trees, the wisteria climbing the weathered brick towards our window, and the high walls, with their old stone copings, stretching away to the cobbled yard under the elms. Every day I went up and down that path to the garage in the yard, but it looked so different from above. Wait "Wait a minute, Helen," I said. "Let me sit on that chair." She had laid the breakfast on the bench where we ate, and this was where the difficulty arose. Because it was a tall bench, and our recently acquired high stool fitted it, but our chair didn't. "No, I'm all right, Jim. Really, I am." She smiled at me reassuringly from her absurd position, almost at eye level with her plate. "You can't be all right," I retorted. "Your chin's nearly in among your cornflakes. Please let me sit there." She patted the seat of the stool. "Come on, stop arguing. Sit down and have your breakfast." This, I felt, just wouldn't do. I tried a different tack. "Helen," I said severely, "get off that chair." "No," she replied without looking at me, her lips pushed forward in a characteristic pout which I always found enchanting, but which also meant she wasn't kidding. I was at a loss. I toyed with the idea of pulling her off the chair, but she was a big girl. We had a previous physical tryout when a minor disagreement had escalated into a wrestling match, and though I thoroughly enjoyed the contest and actually won in the end, I had been surprised by her sheer strength. At this time in the morning, I didn't feel up to it. I sat on the stool. After breakfast, Helen began to boil water for the washing up, the next stage in our routine. Meanwhile, I went downstairs, collected my gear, including suture material for a foal which had cut its leg, and went out the side door to the garden. Just about opposite the rockery, I turned and looked up at our window. It was open at the bottom, and an arm emerged holding a dishcloth. I waved, and the dishcloth waved back furiously. It was the start to every day. And, driving from the yard, it seemed a good start. In fact, everything was good. The raucous cawing of the rooks in the elms above as I closed the double doors, the clean fragrance of the air which greeted me every morning, and the challenge and interest of my job. The injured foal was at Robert Corner's farm, and I hadn't been there long before I spotted Jock, his sheepdog. And I began to watch the dog because behind a vet's daily chore of treating his patients, there is always the fascinating kaleidoscope of animal personality, and Jock was an interesting case. A lot of farm dogs are partial to a little light relief from their work. They like to play, and one of their favorite games is chasing cars off the premises. Often I drove off with a hairy form galloping alongside, and the dog would usually give a final defiant bark after a few hundred yards to speed me on my way. But Jock was different. He was really dedicated. Car chasing to him was a deadly serious art, which he practiced daily without a trace of levity. Corner's farm was at the end of a long track, twisting for nearly a mile between its stone walls down through the gently sloping fields to the road below, and Jock didn't consider he had done his job properly until he had escorted his chosen vehicle right to the very foot. So his hobby was an exacting one. I watched him now as I finished stitching the foal's leg and began to tie on a bandage. He was slinking about the buildings, a skinny little creature who, without his mass of black and white hair, would have been an almost invisible mite, and he was playing out a transparent charade of pretending he was taking no notice of me. Wasn't the least bit interested in my presence, in fact. But his furtive glances in the direction of the stable, his repeated crisscrossing of my line of vision gave him away. He was waiting for his big moment. When I was putting on my shoes and throwing my Wellingtons into the boot, I saw him again. Or, rather, part of him, just a long nose and one eye protruding from beneath a broken door. It wasn't until I had started the engine and begun to move off that he finally declared himself, stealing out from his hiding place, body low, tail trailing, eyes fixed intently on the car's front wheels. And as I gathered speed and headed down the track, he broke into an effortless lope. I had been through this before, and I was always afraid he might run in front of me, so I put my foot down and began to hurtle downhill. This was where Jock came into his own. I often wondered how he'd fare against a racing greyhound because, by golly, he could run. That sparse frame housed a perfect physical machine, and the slender limbs reached and flew again and again, devouring the stony ground beneath. keeping up with the speeding car with joyful ease. There was a sharp bend about halfway down where Jock invariably sailed over the wall and streaked across the turf, a little dark blur against the green, and having craftily cut off the corner, he reappeared like a missile, zooming over the gray stones lower down. This put him into a nice position for the run to the road, and when he finally saw me on to the tarmac, my last view of him was of a happy, panting face looking after me. Clearly, he considered it was a job well done, and he would wander contentedly back up to the farm to await the next session, perhaps with the postman or the baker's van. And there was another side to Jock. He was an outstanding performer at the sheepdog trials, and Mr. Corner had won many trophies with him. In fact, the farmer could have sold the little animal for a lot of money, but couldn't be persuaded to part with him. Instead, he purchased another dog, a scrawny little female counterpart of Jock, and a trial winner in her own right. With this combination, Mr. Corner thought he could breed some world-beating types for sale. On my visits to the farm, she joined us in the car chasing, but it seemed as though she was doing it more or less to humor her new mate, and she always gave up at the first bend, leaving Jock in command. You could see her heart wasn't in it. When the pups arrived, 7 fluffy black balls tumbling about the yard and getting under everybody's feet, Jock watched indulgently as they tried to follow him in his pursuit of my vehicle, and you could almost see him laughing as they fell over their feet and were left trailing far behind. It happened that I didn't have to go there for about 10 months, but I saw Robert Corner in the market occasionally, and he told me he was training the pups and they were shaping well. Not that they needed much training, it was in their blood, and he said they had tried to round up the cattle and sheep nearly as soon as they could walk. When I finally saw them, they were like 7 Jocks, meager, darting little creatures flitting noiselessly about the buildings, and it didn't take me long to find out that they had learned more than sheep herding from their father. There was something very evocative about the way they began to prowl around in the background as I prepared to get into my car, peeping furtively from behind straw bales, slinking with elaborate nonchalance into favorable positions for a quick getaway. As I settled into my seat, I could sense they were all crouched in readiness for the off. I revved my engine, let in the clutch with a bump, and shot across the yard, and in a second the immediate vicinity erupted in a mass of hairy forms. I roared onto the track and put my foot down, and on either side of me the little animals pelted along shoulder to shoulder, their faces all wearing the intent, fanatical expression I knew so well. When Jock cleared the wall, the 7 pups went with him, and when they reappeared and entered the home straight, I noticed something different. On past occasions, Jock had always had one eye on the car. This was what he considered his opponent. But now, on that last quarter mile, as he hurtled along at the head of a shaggy phalanx, he was glancing at the pups on either side as though they were the main opposition. And there was no doubt that he was in trouble. Superbly fit though he was, these stringy bundles of bone and sinew which he had fathered had all his speed plus the newly minted energy of youth, and it was taking every shred of his power to keep up with them. Indeed, there was one terrible moment when he stumbled and was engulfed by the bounding creatures around him. It seemed that all was lost, but there was a core of steel in Jock. Eyes popping, nostrils dilated, he fought his way through the pack until by the time we reached the road he was once more in the lead. But it had taken its toll. I slowed down before driving away and looked down at the little animal, standing with lolling tongue and heaving flanks on the grass verge. It must have been like this with all the other vehicles, and it wasn't a merry game anymore. I suppose it sounds silly to say you could read a dog's thoughts, but everything in his posture betrayed the mounting apprehension that his days of supremacy were numbered. Just around the corner lay the unthinkable ignominy of being left trailing in the rear of that litter of young upstarts, and as I drew away, Jock looked after me, and his expression was eloquent. How long can I keep this up? I felt for the little dog, and on my next visit to the farm about 2 months later, I wasn't looking forward to witnessing the final degradation which I felt was inevitable. But when I drove into the yard, I found the place strangely unpopulated. Robert Corner was forking hay into the cow's racks in the byre. He turned as I came in. "Where are all your dogs?" I asked. He put down his fork. "All gone. There's a market for good working sheepdogs. I've done right out of the job." "But you've still got Jock." "Oh, yeah, couldn't part with him. He's over there." And so he was, creeping around as of old, pretending he wasn't watching me. And when the happy time finally arrived and I drove away, it was like it used to be, with the lean little animal herring along by the side of the car, but relaxed, enjoying the game, winging effortlessly over the wall and beating the car down to the tarmac with no trouble at all. I think I was as relieved as he was that he was left alone with his supremacy unchallenged, that he was still top dog. And that is the end of chapter 2. And I hope you guys all have a fantastic week, and I cannot wait to see you soon. And yeah, I hope it's a great week. All right. I'll talk to y'all later. Bye.